We have a great program this morning on human rights and an outstanding panel. And I will introduce the panel. They will join us on the stage, and following their presentations, there will be microphones on each side of the hall so that you can go and ask questions and make comments to their presentations. Bob Pastor is well known to the Carter Center in that he was a distinguished fellow at the Carter Center and a professor at Emory University, and started the Latin American and Caribbean program at the center, as well as moved into democracy and elections and began the election work and even carried that out through the beginning of our relationship with China. He currently is professor of the School of International Service at American University in Washington, and he's director of the Center for Democracy and Election Management. He was on the national security staff during President Carter's years in Washington as President of the United States. So join me in welcoming Bob Pastor, who will come to the... John Shattuck is a longtime friend of ours and the Carter Center, and is currently president and rector of Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. Prior to that, he was the CEO of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, and we worked with him in that capacity, but even worked more closely during his period as Assistant Secretary of State for DRL, which is Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, during the Clinton administration. And he has worked not only as an Assistant Secretary of State, but as the U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic. So join me in welcoming Ambassador John Shattuck. And Karin Ryan is one of our own right at the Carter Center. She's director of our Human Rights Program and has been active in everything the Carter Center has been engaged in, from our beginning Human Rights Carter Manil Awards all the way through to Karin's own personal interest in the Congo, and that we now have a human rights house in the Congo that was spearheaded by Karin and her interest in that country and had led us into even monitoring elections in the Congo. But Karin is also shepherding all of our interactions and interventions that she recommends to President and Mrs. Carter in terms of writing heads of state on human rights abuses, but is leading our efforts on the Human Rights Defenders Conferences that we have approximately every other year, and will, I assume, mention the upcoming Human Rights Defenders Conference, which we plan for Cairo, Egypt, in June. So join me in welcoming Karin Ryan. And then they will make comments, and then we'll recognize you in the audience if you would go to the microphones that will be set up.
Thank you very much, John, and thank all of you for coming to this glorious weekend in San Diego. I thought I'd start with a story about the first president ever to make human rights an important issue for U.S. foreign policy. Born in Georgia, went on to be governor of a great state. You know the man. It was Woodrow Wilson, of course. One night when he was governor of the great state of New Jersey, his young, ambitious aide knocked on his door at 3 a.m. to inform him that the Attorney General in his cabinet had just passed away. Wilson was puzzled that this required waking him up at 3 o'clock in the morning, but also saddened by the news and said, "He will sorely be missed." The young aide decided to take it another step and said, "I wonder, Governor, whether you would consider allowing me to replace the Attorney General." Woodrow Wilson, losing his patience but not his wit, said, "It's okay for you to replace the Attorney General if it's also okay with the Undertaker." Well, we have learned that President Carter believed that the United States didn't discover human rights discovered the United States. But the truth is that human rights was never a central element of U.S. foreign policy. It was largely consigned to the undertaker until Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to raise it. Unfortunately, his objective then was to encourage Latin American governments to elect good men in constitutional circumstances. And his principal means for doing that was to introduce the U.S. Marines. So that was the first lesson for America, that even good goals can't be effectively transmitted by bad means. The next time that the United States really raised the level of human rights was by the second best First Lady of the 20th century. The first, of course, is with us today, Mrs. Carter. The second best was Eleanor Roosevelt, who, at the end of World War II, took the lead in getting the United Nations to agree to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a foundation and standard for human rights that made them clearly universal and that were central to the ability of the United States in subsequent years to make the case that human rights is not just a U.S. issue, it's a universal issue. Of course, human rights was part of the reason or part of the rationale for U.S. entries into the First and Second World War. Woodrow Wilson referred to making the world safe for democracy, and Franklin Roosevelt talked about the four freedoms, but the truth is that one of our principal allies in the Second World War denied not just those freedoms, but many others. In the Cold War, human rights became an instrument in part of a quiver of other instruments in the Cold War against communism to assert U.S. superiority and also to put the communist world on the defensive. But the truth is, it left us with some lack of credibility, since during this period of time, we remained allies with many military dictatorships. There were three changes that occurred that really fostered a revolutionary change in our understanding of human rights in the world. The first occurred in the early 1970s in Latin America, when there was literally a plague of repression. Disappearances of young people, people being tortured. Military coups had always occurred in Latin America, but usually what would happen is the general would take over the presidential office and he'd put the president and a few of his advisors on a plane to Washington or Miami or to Madrid or to Mexico, and that was it. By the 1970s, however, the democratic movement had become a mass movement. And so when the military took over power in Chile and Argentina and Brazil and Ecuador and Peru, they felt the need to repress large numbers of people. And the torture and the disappearances were unspeakable and unconscionable. Unfortunately, the response by our government, President Nixon, President Ford, and Secretary of State Kissinger, were to assert at the beginning that human rights should not be part of our foreign policy, that would not be effective in the world, and then subsequently to find ways to assist many of those military governments, like Chile's General Pinochet, with aid, despite the fact that they weren't supposed to do that. The Congress reacted to that with new leaders like Tom Harkin, Lee Hamilton, Steve Solars, and others, by tying American aid to improvement in human rights. Kissinger rejected it, ultimately found a way around it, but it took the next important event, which was the candidacy and subsequently the election of Jimmy Carter, that brought human rights to the fore and to the centerpiece of American foreign policy. One of my first opportunities to work with President Carter was during the campaign when his foreign policy advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, asked if I would prepare some talking points for him for a speech that he would give at the Chicago Council for Foreign Relations during the campaign. And so I wrote out a series of talking points about how Kissinger was undermining the basic principles and the authenticity of American foreign policy by diverting aid to military repressive governments in Chile and talking about a special relationship with the military government in Brazil. And 1 week later, I opened the New York Times and I saw those talking points in the speech from Jimmy Carter, and I said, wow. I said, finally, we have a leader who is willing to speak up for what America stands for in a way that could make a real difference. And I was very fortunate to have been invited to join the National Security Council. President Carter, from the very beginning, enunciated the centrality of human rights to American foreign policy. And he based it first on these multilateral foundations that began with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He signed immediately the International Covenant on Civil and Political Liberties, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. He waited until Mrs. Carter, leading the first delegation of his administration to Latin America, arrived in San Jose, Costa Rica, which was where the American Convention on Human Rights had been negotiated, to sign that same convention for the first time in 1977 at the OAS. These three instruments allowed President Carter to say in his dialogue with other leaders and other military leaders that we're not talking about U.S. values, we're talking about universal values to which all nations that are a member of the United Nations have an obligation to adhere to. He moved in the first 2 months of his administration to show how committed he was by modifying the foreign aid budget of President Ford to deny military aid to a series of military governments throughout the world. That showed that he was serious. A few governments understood immediately that Carter meant business. One of them was President Duvalier in Haiti, who on the election of President Carter, even before his inauguration, released all of the political prisoners that were in his jails. 4 years later, after the inability to be reelected by President Carter and the election of Ronald Reagan, even before his inauguration, he rearrested all those political prisoners. So while some people pretended to be confused by the human rights policy, the truth is the message got across very quickly. He built up multilateral institutions. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights had been moribund. He quadrupled the budget, quadrupled the staff, and raised the issue with every leader in Latin America that was a party to this commission. He tried to establish the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights in the UN, but was unable to. But the multilateral approach gave the U.S. credibility, and most importantly of all, the attempts on the administration's part to make clear that right-wing military dictators, though they may pretend to be part of the war against communism, were not our friends until they respected human rights. And that gave the U.S. policy a credibility which it simply didn't have before then. To the world, the policy was only aimed at one purpose, the communist world. But when it was aimed also at governments that were theoretically on our side of the communist divide, for the first time, the world began to realize that the U.S. was really committed to human rights. And that had a big effect everywhere. Our ambassadors were all sent in all of the time to talk about human rights. But the real center of it was President Carter's own unique perspective on this. He would invite military governments in and urge them to improve the situation. He would say to them, look, there are a lot of reports out there of human rights violations, and I understand from you that these reports are not accurate. A very simple way to deal with this: invite in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Invite in the United Nations to observe. Invite any legitimate international organization. Let them report on this. And that immediately put them on the defensive. What was the impact? Well, there was great controversy. One leader, former governor of California by the name of Ronald Reagan in 1978, said that President Carter had dismayed our true friends in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. The one thing they all had in common was that they were military governments, and they were not our true friends. The people in their countries were our true friends. And by making clear to the people that we wanted to support their human rights, I think we bought a long-term approach and long-term credibility with them. Hugo Banzer, who had to step down from power in 1978, a dictator in Bolivia, said, "I never received a letter from President Carter, but I sure felt the pressure to step down." And part of that pressure came from a larger approach that included the importance of democracy. Mrs. Carter played a central role in that at the very beginning of the administration. She went to Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil, 3 military governments, and encouraged them to begin the transition to democracy, to which they all did. And she returned for the inauguration of a democratic president in Ecuador and Peru as well. So this broader approach had an impact. The biggest impact of all were in the number of people who were saved. Disappearances that had been very heavily prevalent in Argentina and Brazil and Chile within a few years of the administration stopped. Political prisoners, 30,000 political prisoners were released from Indonesia. There were 50,000 Russian Jews that were released as a result of President Carter's efforts with the Russian government. Only 300 a year had been released before his election, 50,000 during his term in office. When he raised with Foreign Minister Gromyko the importance of human rights and named several dissidents, Gromyko responded in September of 1977 by saying, "Who is this Sharinsky? I've never heard of him. He is a microscopic dot on the landscape." And that symbolized the difference. For the Soviet Union, every individual was a microscopic, insignificant dot. But for Jimmy Carter and for the United States, every person matters. 3,600 political prisoners from Cuba were released, 600 from Paraguay. All over the world, there were people who were released as a result of his many efforts on behalf of them. The American Convention on Human Rights, which he signed at the beginning, had only 2 signatories at the beginning. As a result of the Carter administration's efforts, 14 signed it, and it came into force by the end of the administration. Unfortunately, the U.S. Has still not ratified the American Convention on Human Rights. All of this became possible because of his motivation, because of his efforts, but also because he organized the administration to deal with it. Because as we know, priorities are one thing, but having a government move in the right direction is something else. He set up an interagency committee that every single week, under the Deputy Secretary of State, would evaluate foreign aid and every element of our relationship with every government to make sure that all of the aid and everything was channeled for a principal purpose, which was to improve human rights. And those debates, I participated in many of them. The regional bureaus in the State Department would say, don't put too much pressure on this government. We need them for this and that. The Human Rights Bureau would say, you need to put pressure on them, otherwise they won't do anything. And the Deputy Secretary of State would often turn to the NSC people, like myself, who both cared about the region and cared about human rights, and say, yes, in this case, we should move forward with some sanctions. In this case, we should give them rewards, because President Carter believed that any step forward deserved reinforcement on the part of the United States. So overall, what was the impact? I think it was supremely consequential for the United States and the whole world. Multilateral organizations, everybody understood that human rights was what the United States was all about. At the end of his administration, after he was, as he likes to put it, involuntarily retired. But those of us at the Carter Center know that was just the end of his first term. He's now in his 10th term. We have promoted elections abroad, but now free of term limits. President Carter is going forward with the same human rights agenda. But at the end of his term, at the OAS, the president of the OAS General Assembly stood up and said, there has never been a more creative act from the United States than President Carter's human rights policy. He said it has given hope to every person in the Americas, and it has helped the United States recover from the stain of being associated with dictators in the past. So there is no doubt in my mind that this is a profound effect. But in concluding, let me quote from another leader, Vice President Dan Quayle, who once said that the movement, he said this at the end of the Cold War, the movement towards human rights and democratization is inevitable, but that could change.
Along with the spelling of potato, no doubt.
And actually, he was right about both. And with that, I'll turn to John, who will tell us what happened.
Great.
This was his first principal human rights address at Notre Dame University, where Father Hesburgh greeted him, in which he laid out very clearly the centrality of human rights to American foreign policy, and made very clear that human rights was not solely a part of our strategy against the Soviet Union. It was a universal strategy on behalf of the rest of the on behalf of all of the peoples of the world. And he also said something else that was very important. He said that we need, if we are going to be effective in the world, we need to make sure that these human rights that we talk about around the world should also be applied to the United States, the single standard.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that welcome. I'm very glad to be with you. You may have started a new graduation trend, which I don't deplore, that is throwing peanuts on graduation day. The more that are used or consumed, the higher the price goes. But I want to speak to you today about the strands that connect our actions overseas with our essential character as a nation. I believe we can have a foreign policy that is democratic, that is based on fundamental values, and that uses power and influence, which we have, for humane purposes. We can also have a foreign policy that the American people both support and, for a change, know about and understand. I have a quiet confidence in our own political system. Because we know that democracy works, we can reject the arguments of those rulers who deny human rights to their people. The world is still divided by ideological disputes, dominated by regional conflicts, and threatened by the danger that we will not resolve the differences of race and wealth without violence or without drawing into combat the major military powers. We can no longer separate the traditional issues of war and peace from the new global questions of justice, equity, and human rights. I've tried to make these premises clear to the American people since last January. Let me review what we have been doing and discuss what we intend to do. First, we've reaffirmed America's commitment to human rights as a fundamental tenet of our foreign policy. Throughout the world today, in free nations and in totalitarian countries as well, there is a preoccupation with the subject of human freedom, human rights. And I believe it's incumbent on us in this country to keep that discussion, that debate, that contention alive. We've moved to engage the Soviet Union in a joint effort to halt the strategic arms race. This race is not only dangerous, it's morally deplorable. We must put an end to it. We hope that we can take joint steps with all nations toward a final agreement eliminating nuclear weapons completely from our arsenals of death. We will persist in this effort. We're taking deliberate steps to improve the chances of lasting peace in the Middle East through wide-ranging consultation with leaders of the countries involved, Israel, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. We've found some areas of agreement and some movement toward consensus. The negotiations must continue. What is peace? What does it mean to the Israelis? What does it mean to the Arab neighbors? How can the dispute over border delineations be established and settled with a feeling of security on both sides? And the issue of the Palestinian homeland. More than 100 years ago, Abraham Lincoln said that our nation could not exist half slave and half free. We know that a peaceful world cannot longer exist 1/3 rich and 2/3 hungry. Most nations share our faith. Our policy is rooted in our moral values, which never change. Our policy is reinforced by our material wealth and by our military power. Our policy is designed to serve mankind. And it is a policy that I hope will make you proud to be Americans. Thank you very much.
It's very difficult to follow those words, Mr. President, but I'll do my best. Thank you so much, and Mrs. Carter. It's a real privilege to be here, and I didn't have the privilege of serving in your administration, but in many respects I feel through the Carter Center and through all the work that you've done, I have served under you now for some 38 years, and I started as a young civil rights lawyer, so let me just say a little bit about how I first felt the thrill of the words that we've just heard on the screen as President Carter articulated the connection between American civil rights and the commitment to freedom that we had, and he and others had pursued so ardently, and the international struggle for freedom. It was something that those of us who had long thought about our own constitutional rights and civil rights hadn't really projected in an international dimension until it came along in his administration. I was then a young lawyer in the American Civil Liberties Union, and I was serving with Pat Darien, who is a member of our Board of Trustees, a very distinguished figure in the field of human rights and civil rights, chosen by President Carter to be his first Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, and it was through Pat's example that I really began to understand what this struggle was all about. Remarkably for me, some 15 years later, I found myself her successor, or one of her successors, several times removed, as the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. And my first act in that position was to travel to Vienna, Austria, as the deputy head of the United States delegation to the World Conference on Human Rights, a conference that couldn't have been imagined until President Carter put these issues on the map, and to work under President Carter, who for several days was the head of our delegation. And I learned something very important that I took with me all through the time that I served as Assistant Secretary by being there in Vienna with President Carter in 1993. The conference was taking place in a large hall, and all the governments were operating on one floor in that large hall. But underneath the governments, in the basement, were all of these non-governmental organizations, human rights activists, people from all over the world who were struggling to present their own case for human rights advancement. President Carter said to me, "Spend more time with the NGOs than you do with the government, and you will advance the cause very effectively." And I have to say I did. And he, of course, has inspired hundreds of millions of activists who have proceeded through this time since he served as president in many, many different parts of the world. President Carter came to office at a time of great moral challenge and political division in our country. The dark clouds of Vietnam and Watergate hung very heavily over the country, and he used the instrument of universal human rights as a way of helping Americans to some extent find their better selves and address this terrible crisis of moral dimensions that had existed in the past. I, as a young civil rights lawyer, had been very much involved in the defense of civil liberties against the administration of President Nixon, who had wiretapped many of his people serving under him and others, journalists and the like, in the name of national security, in an effort, as he said, to try to track down leaks and otherwise secure the country against outside intervention. It was a time when civil liberties were under assault. And in fact, as we all know, ultimately the House of Representatives issued bills of impeachment against President Nixon on this very basis. When President Carter became president, the reforms were needed to address this terrible imbalance in civil liberties. And one of those that I just want to briefly mention that was enacted under his presidency, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, was an effort to bring judicial control into areas that presidents had previously asserted were their national security commander-in-chief responsibilities, such as wiretapping people they felt were security risks, as the Nixon administration had done. And the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, authorized by the president, signed by him into law, I think, in my view, is the only time in modern history where a president of the United States has essentially said, I am going to cede a small amount of authority that has been asserted by my predecessors in the interest of protecting the civil rights and civil liberties of Americans. And, of course, this was the same approach in many respects that he took internationally. And this is very different from some of the current situations that we have seen with respect to the assertion of presidential power in ways that have impinged on human rights here at home. And I'll get to those in just a minute. But it's my task on the panel, in a sense, to fast forward and take a look at what the legacy of the Carter administration was vis-a-vis human rights and how much it was preserved or changed and how much it affected the future of human rights as an integral part of foreign policy. There were really three different periods. The Cold War period, of course, which was the Carter presidency period, as well as the presidency of Ronald Reagan. The post-Cold War period that followed that, 1989 and beyond. And then what I would call the current period which we're in, which is the post-9/11 period. All of them involving major challenges to human rights, competing interests that presidents have felt. But I would say in each case that a president has continued to some extent, greater or lesser, the legacy of commitment to human rights that we saw in the case so brilliantly in the Carter administration. I think human rights have sometimes been marginalized by other interests, competing interests, as they were in the case of the U.S. Efforts to develop further trade relations with large parts of the world, particularly China. Human rights were sometimes overpowered entirely, as they have been, I think, in many respects in the period of the counterterrorism policies that are being pursued and have been pursued particularly immediately after 9/11. Sometimes human rights advocacy by the U.S. government has basically followed the larger trends of history, as I would argue is the case from 1989 and immediately thereafter, when so much remarkable development occurred in the world in the advancement of human rights and democracy, not only in the former Soviet Union and its countries in Eastern and Central Europe, but also, of course, very powerfully in South Africa, and certainly in the Latin American dictatorships that were so much in the sight of the Carter human rights policy. And sometimes human rights have been actually at the forefront of larger U.S. strategic objectives, as I would argue they were in the case of efforts to end the war in Bosnia at the time when over 200,000 people had been killed in the largest genocide since the Second World War in Europe, and human rights were brought to bear in the effort to end that war in the Dayton Peace Accords. But these have been all struggles inside of each of these presidencies. In the case of President Reagan, of course, there was initially an effort to downgrade and almost completely eliminate the Human Rights Bureau, but I think the Congress was not going to allow that to happen, and certainly the legacy of the Carter years didn't let that happen. So President Reagan actually ultimately did use human rights effectively, as Bob has said, as an instrument in the Cold War, addressing particularly the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, he accused, and his officials accused the Carter administration of being naive, for having had a universal and even-handed approach toward human rights. But the Reagan administration itself followed a very double standard by effectively saying that Cold War friends of the United States, even if they're dictators in Latin America and elsewhere, will not come under close scrutiny for their human rights policies. We're going to save that largely for the Soviet Union and our ideological enemies. And this, I would say, created a great deal of resentment and negative feeling about U.S. human rights policy in those parts of the world that were struggling to overcome decades of colonialism and to develop their own freedom, and particularly to struggle against dictatorships which were denying them their human rights. So I'm afraid, even though the effective nature of the human rights policy in the Reagan administration can certainly be seen in its work on the Soviet Union, I think there was a rather negative effect in terms of the double standard that was followed more broadly. Then we get to the post-Cold War period, where democracy and human rights are breaking forth in these largely peaceful revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and most dramatically in South Africa. There are even scholars who begin to write that this is the end of history, that we now have human rights and liberal democracy, essentially, that are going to be the next and rather continuing flow of history. But, of course, this was not to be the case. There were two powerful forces that were at work in the world at that time, and U.S. foreign policy focused on one and, for the beginning period, ignored the second to the detriment of human rights. Those forces were the forces of integration, democracy and human rights developing in places that had not seen them before, but also forces of integration in terms of global movements of capital and trade and investment, forces of integration in terms of communications across borders, the new development of the internet, etc., but equally powerful, unleashed by the end of the Cold War, were what I call forces of disintegration, where the old global bipolarity between the Soviets and the U.S. And how that was ramified throughout the world ended in a number of countries beginning to disintegrate, Yugoslavia being the most dramatic example, Rwanda the most tragic example, and many other countries that became failed states, some of which led to mass atrocities and ultimately even genocide in the case of Rwanda and Bosnia. And what was happening in foreign policy in the administration of George H.W. Bush and the beginning of the Clinton years even was that there was an effort to essentially turn human rights policy into a cheerleader for the forces of integration, to essentially say that we will do all that we can to keep these wonderful developments that have occurred from 1989 going forward, but rather turn backs on the forces of disintegration with devastating effect, in my view. We saw this in the case of Secretary of State James Baker in the Bush administration, who said when asked by the press, what is the U.S. going to do about the mass atrocities and genocide in Bosnia and the disintegration of these various states into separate entities? He said, we have no dog in that fight, a rather famous quote, looking at things through a Cold War lens. But the Clinton administration was not much better in those earlier years when asked what will be done about the rapidly developing genocide in Rwanda. My friend and at that point boss, Secretary of State Warren Christopher, said we have many other competing priorities. So unfortunately, in the beginning, the forces of disintegration began to move very rapidly in the world, and human rights were devastated by them. The Human Rights Bureau, which I was then serving as the head of, did its best to try to spotlight these abuses. I traveled several times to Rwanda. I was involved in developing human rights reports on Bosnia and other places, and taking very much the inspiration from the Carter human rights era of, if you will, naming and shaming and developing more attention for human rights abuses. I think finally we began to get the attention that was necessary, and eventually, as I said earlier, the intervention in Bosnia took place much too late, in my view, but it was a new kind of diplomacy backed by force, military force, which was an effort to stop the atrocities from going forward. An earlier example of this had taken place in Haiti, where President Carter played a very key role, where there were mass atrocities that were being committed by a military dictatorship, and the democratically elected president, Aristide, had been thrown out of the country by the dictatorship. And there was an effort to bring back Aristide, and working with President Carter, President Clinton essentially forced, through the intervention of President Carter, this certainly has a complex story that we don't have time to go into now, forced the departure of the military dictator, and then there was a peaceful entry of a military force that was authorized fully by the UN Security Council and the Organization of American States. So slowly but surely, I think human rights emerged back into the center of foreign policy in the Clinton years. Major achievements, the development of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, that really started under the leadership of President Carter, very important international institution. The development of international courts of justice, the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, to end the cycles of violence by holding accountable those who were responsible. All of these were developed during that period. We get to 9/11, and I'll just spend a very short time on this because I don't want to take too much time, and I certainly want to hear what Karin says about all the work of the Carter Center now. But 9/11 was a devastating effect on human rights, as I think we would all agree. It was the ultimate example of the forces of disintegration at work in the world, in this case in the form of a new form of terrorism that had not previously been seen, certainly had not been understood by the United States, and which led to a politics of fear and a politics of war which overwhelmed most of the efforts to limit the kind of counterterrorism policy that was going to be developed afterwards. And there were also figures in the White House and in the Defense Department in the administration of George W. Bush who felt that the presidency needed to be strengthened, and this was a perfect occasion to do it, and they asserted theories of presidential power that went far beyond anything that had been previously asserted, and they're so contrary to the kind of presidential restraint that we saw in the Carter administration, as I mentioned earlier, in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. So we had a time when, to some extent, civil rights in an international context through U.S. foreign policy were somewhat suspended. The international laws, the Geneva Conventions, were essentially found by White House lawyers to be out of date and quaint, and even though they were supposed to limit the use of any interrogation techniques that would be tantamount to torture. What ultimately transpired, as we know, is the development of the Guantanamo permanent detention facility, a policy of waterboarding and torture and various kinds of interrogation techniques which were fundamental violations of human rights. And frankly, a Congress that went largely along with this without trying to restrain the president. Now, President Obama, I think, has changed some of that. He has certainly executed self-restraint on the interrogation policies and has prohibited the use of torture, has redeveloped U.S. willingness to adapt the principles of the Geneva Conventions. But nonetheless, he continues in many respects to assert the same kind of power and authority over these counterterrorism matters that we saw earlier, particularly in the use of drone warfare. And we've seen most recently the willingness essentially to target an American citizen through drone attacks in ways that, were it to be in a more normal law enforcement context, would be subject to much more due process restraint than we've seen in the case of the drone attacks that are remotely conducted. And I think what all this adds up to, and I do give President Obama significant credit for certainly reducing the military approach toward counterterrorism in many respects. But I think we've seen a lot of tactical victories in the battle over terrorism, but we have no sense of what the strategic long-term objectives might be. And we still are in an era where war is the primary mode as opposed to a more law enforcement mode, which I think normally one uses to deal with massive criminal acts like terrorism. And we need now, I would argue, and I think this is a good moment to do this in this audience before our great first president articulating human rights as a foreign policy objective, President Carter. We need to get back to the Carter legacy in that respect. We need a framework of human rights which would be part of the larger strategic framework for addressing some of the most difficult security issues that we face today. We need to win the battle for hearts and minds as much as we need to win tactical victories in the war on terrorism. And I think to do so, we need to understand and engage with people whose legitimate struggles for freedom are being felt worldwide, probably nowhere more so powerfully than in the Arab Spring, with all of its difficulties and backsliding that takes place. So I am an optimist when all is said and done, and I think this legacy that you've given us, Mr. President, of a human rights framework for foreign policy, I think can return. I think to some extent it has. We've come out of the darkest days of post-9/11. And I would end with two quotes. One, Dr. King's wonderful quote that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And the other quote, which comes from a person who is a hero of mine and probably all of ours, Václav Havel, who I got to know when I was ambassador in the Czech Republic, a remarkable human rights figure and transformative figure in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 and beyond. A very sobering quote where he says, I am not an idealist because I do not believe that all ends well all the time. I am also not an optimist because I don't believe that all ends well all the time. But I am a realist who believes in hope. And hope, ultimately, is the belief that freedom has meaning and is always worth the struggle and can achieve great objectives. Thank you very much.
Well, I couldn't have actually written a preface for my what I want to talk about any better than you both did, because it's my job to talk about the work of the Carter Center and how we see this, and we actually do see that as the opportunity and the responsibility that we have, which is to build on the legacy of this presidency and these values that were so dramatically introduced into the American consciousness, not just the American consciousness, but the global consciousness. So just a couple of touchstones back into the pre-World War II period. Before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was the Atlantic Charter that FDR and Churchill agreed to, which was a means for bringing American public support into the war, to bring American participation into the war. And what was the Atlantic Charter? It was actually the predecessor to the Universal Declaration, because what it said was, we will stand for human freedom and the elimination of tyranny in the world. It was a grand statement. And there was a young group of lawyers in South Africa in 1943 who responded to the Atlantic Declaration, and among them was a young lawyer named Nelson Mandela. And in this statement, they basically said, okay, we're going to take you up on this promise. And there's a long document that was produced by this group of lawyers called The African Views on the Atlantic Charter. It took 50 years for Nelson Mandela to bring the promise of the Atlantic Charter and then the Universal Declaration to South Africa. But he did, 50 years. And our work at the Carter Center can be best described in this way, that the Nelson Mandelas of the world are out there. They exist in every society, from Bahrain to Saudi Arabia, believe it or not, to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the United States. Young lawyers like at the ACLU, who are our version of the champions of human rights today. That human rights defenders are the people in every society whose job it is to bring freedom to their own society. And why this is so significant as a legacy of President Carter is that that's what he did. When he said to the Soviets, Sharansky isn't just a dot in an ocean. Sharansky is a freedom fighter. And where there are freedom fighters, we will stand with them. And this is the Carter Center's approach to promoting democracy and human rights, but also a broad definition of human rights. When we work on a disease or a health program or an election, how do we approach it? We approach it from this very, very, I want to use the word humble, though I don't think they would use the word humble. It's just human. It's a human connection, that people can solve their own problems, and our job is to figure out how to help them, what kind of support we can offer them. So when President Carter was in the White House, there were people like Sharansky, there was Kim Dae-jung, who was on the edge of being executed, and the Carter administration saved his life. He went on to advance democracy in Korea, South Korea. And there were others like this. They are individuals, but they are the promise for freedom in their own countries. So the Human Rights Program at the Carter Center has really focused on this idea. And we host these gatherings, the Human Rights Defenders Forum, and we bring the most courageous and effective human rights leaders from all over the world. And in 2003, what we did was I had left the Carter Center for a period to study music. It's another chapter of my life. But I couldn't stay away, and they called me and said, we need you to come, after 9/11. It was this catastrophe for human rights. Because in the 1990s, what were we doing? We were sort of building something that was building over time. There was sort of this trajectory of progress for human rights that it was slow, and it was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sort of like this. Nonetheless, it was forward moving. So, it was this sort of slow progress. But after 9/11, it was actually a reversal of human rights. And so we all in human rights felt this dramatic need to do something. And they called me and said, we want you to organize to bring human rights defenders from all over the world to talk about the impact of counterterrorism on human rights. And so we had this forum in 2003, November. It was only 6 months after the Iraq War invasion. And what they said from 43 countries, human rights defenders said, if the United States abandons its commitment to human rights, then we in Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan, all of the countries that were represented, we're sunk. Because when we go to the courts and we have somebody who's been detained, they'll say, oh no, they're a terrorist or they're suspected of terrorism. We'll see this arbitrary exercise of executive power happening everywhere. And in fact, that's what has happened. The International Commission of Jurists issues a newsletter every couple of months documenting all the cases of the abuse of counterterrorism policies. So this is really an important issue, and one of the hopes of the Carter Center is that there will be an opportunity to bring us back into a policy that's in line with human rights. It's going to be a long, difficult struggle. The other area that we have really worked on, and this goes back to President and Mrs. Carter's moral commitment to human rights, they have been able to, maybe unlike anyone else, to link religious commitment with the advancement of human rights in foreign policy. And not in a, let's say, no pun intended, but in a preachy way, but in a sincere way. So we have begun to reach out to people of faith and religious leaders to be more involved in the human rights movement. And during the issue on counterterrorism, we worked with the National Religious Campaign Against Torture that have become very active on torture issues. And more recently, we have, really because of a speech President Carter gave to the Parliament of World Religions, where he said that my community, my religious community, my own Christian community has failed to advance the rights of women. They've told this story many times about how they decided to leave the Southern Baptist Convention when the Southern Baptist Convention had reversed its commitment to women by rescinding the ability of women to lead the church, to occupy positions of leadership, and when it said that women must be subservient to their husbands. President and Mrs. Carter made a very difficult decision to leave the Southern Baptist Convention, and they have subsequently started to work on a new umbrella organization, the New Baptist Covenant, which tries to bring in these more progressive views into the work of Baptist churches. So in this speech, it was received, we got a huge reaction to the speech that President Carter said, my own community has failed women. So he opened the door to this global conversation on what religion could do, what religious leaders could do, what people of faith, individuals could do if they were to really rely on their belief to advance human rights, and specifically the rights of women. So we held a conference almost 2 years ago in Atlanta where we brought together groups that are actually working within the framework of religion to advance women's rights. I'll just tell one story. There's a group in Senegal that has, because the village imam was the leader of the campaign, they have eliminated genital cutting in 5,000 villages throughout West Africa because the religious leaders and the traditional leaders, the old woman who did the genital cutting, who was the practitioner and who was the cutter, she, together with the imam, went around to different villages to persuade all the villages together to abandon genital cutting all at the same time. But it was because it was done by the religious leadership. So we brought them together with other similar groups that are looking at how you can work within the framework of religion to advance women's rights. And we'll be doing another conference at the end of June in Cairo, Egypt, on this topic, bringing religious scholars, religious leaders. I just had an email the other day that 6 grand muftis from West Africa want to come, from Ghana and Burkina Faso, and that they've heard about it, and they have an initiative on domestic violence. Male grand muftis from West Africa want to come to this conference in Cairo. So together with the moral dimension, but also the U.S. foreign policy dimension, this is a very powerful potential for us to help restore America's position in the world as a leader for human rights. But it's not going to be easy because, as John mentioned, the politics of fear have created a situation where our politicians want to use a military approach to counterterrorism, which in the long term isn't going to work. So we have to work together to give a platform for human rights defenders, to help amplify their voices, and to help them succeed in advancing human rights, and to help our own country also repair our own human rights commitment. Thank you very much.
We'd welcome questions and hopefully a comment from President Carter at some point. There are 2 microphones over there. Please come forward.
Well, I'll make a comment in the meantime. One of the things that Karin has led us to do is to strengthen the United Nations commitment to enforce human rights or to encourage human rights. And when we went with John Shattuck to the meeting in Cairo, in Vienna in 1993, the Carter Center was in the forefront of promoting the idea of having a United Nations High Commission on Human Rights. And the Secretary General of the United Nations was strongly opposed to it, and he and I almost got in a fist fight at breakfast that morning as he said we were wrong, and of course we insisted we were right. Thank you for your help. But anyway, that brought about the creation of an independent, basically, High Commissioner in the United Nations that is specifically charged with promoting human rights. And it was a very good thing. We all, later, during the Clinton administration, we were strong supporters of creating an international criminal court. And the International Criminal Court is now functioning to some degree fairly well. I've been to the Netherlands to meet with all 12 of the members, and I've talked to them and heard their position. But they are now in a position of putting incumbent political leaders on notice that they might very well be charged with criminal actions as they violate basic human rights, with genocide and with war, crimes of war, and so forth. So this has been going on now. And I think those are 2 of the main things in which the Carter Center has participated. And more recently, Karin took the leadership in bringing me up to New York to meet with the key leaders who were trying to decide the future of the International Criminal
the Council, the Human Rights Commission.
Well, it was a commission, right?
The commission.
And it changed to council.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, the United States has rejoined the council as a member, whereas before we withdrew from the convention because it was ineffective and sometimes they criticized the United States. So the International Criminal Council now is developing a very profoundly important, I would say, influence in trying to expose individual communities that is countries and their governments, as they violate human rights. And now they have all agreed basically to let the International Criminal Council, the International Council, do an assessment of each member's human rights policy. Recently, Israel is the first country that said they're not going to submit to this, and the United States is now trying to get Israel to reverse its position and to let the Council assess Israel's human rights policy. So it's got to be a very significant factor in international affairs to have United Nations be a strong proponent of human rights. So those are the kind of things in which the Carter Center has become involved directly with working with leaders in many countries in the world to shape the international official positions through the United Nations.
Well, thank you, sir, because I had that on my list, and I thought I should be brief. So you actually completed my list of issues I wanted to talk about. What's important about this is that the international institutions of the UN, and at the OAS as well, and the African Union more and more, because there is no one country that can be the say-so of what is a human rights violation, it has to be a multilateral organization that puts its imprimatur on a report that says this is the situation. And what President Carter was mentioning, there's this new procedure that we helped negotiate actually with the Council in 2005, 2006. It's called Universal Periodic Review. And it puts every government on the same criteria. You have so many pages to present your view as a government on how you're doing on human rights. And NGOs can come and submit their rebuttals to that, and then a committee of experts will sit there and then question the U.S. I know John has had to sit there representing the U.S., where you have to take criticisms from this committee and then answer them. And the beauty of it is that when that full report comes out, it's an authoritative statement about the priorities for human rights for that country. And then the NGOs, the human rights defenders, what they can do is go back in their country and say, well, we're not being hyperbolic. This is what the UN says you must do. So it's actually the most promising future vehicle for human rights advancement. And one idea that we're working on that we may do in the next couple of years, I hope, is to help start what's called a civil society support unit. We want to convene all the experts in order to do this. That would enable civil society groups to travel to Geneva to actually provide that testimony and then go back to their countries and implement the recommendations. If we did this, then this would be a multiplier effect so that human rights activists would be able to access that UN process. But it sounds very, esoteric, but it's really meaningful in very concrete ways, and I'll just tell one story on why. Once when I was at the UN, actually representing the U.S., I was on the U.S. delegation to the Commission in 2000, and a woman from Mexico told me that if we were having some delicate negotiations on violence against women language, and she came to me and asked me, she said, if we pass this language that would criminalize a crime of passion, in some cultures you might call it honor killing, in Latin America, it's crimes of passion, where if a man is angry at his wife, he can kill her and have total impunity, and the courts will stay away. She said to me, if we pass this resolution, I can go back. She was from Mexico, actually. She was the Mexican delegate. I can go back to my country and change the law so that crimes of passion will be prosecuted as crimes against the state. So this matters to real people, that if the UN passes a resolution like this, it will be implemented. And in Jordan, they have finally, because of this, they have finally outlawed honor killings with 10 to 15-year penalties, whereas before it was never prosecuted. So these UN resolutions actually get implemented in most countries. And so it is really meaningful.
That's great. A question over here.
I'm Dilip Kulkarni.
Identify yourself first, please.
I'm Dilip Kulkarni, and I'm just curious, looking Carter Center outside. Mm-hmm. Everything you're doing is really social justice. Social justice is a vehicle to get to human rights. Yeah. But nowhere I could find the word social justice in the Carter Center documents. I'm just curious why.
We actually, peace with justice is a phrase we do use in different documents. But social justice as a phrase, it's a good question. I mean, there are different ways to characterize what we do: waging peace, building hope, peace. So it's
the reason I said that social justice requires collateral cooperation, multilateral cooperation to enforce the human rights, which Carter Center does.
Yeah, that's right.
And that piece I could not see from looking from outside. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I think Karin is quite right that social justice is what the Carter Center does. Whether it uses that phrase or many other phrases, it's clearly that's the essence of their work. Yes?
Chris Cowan from Iowa. This is for Karin. And I just wanted to comment on a letter that was written by 15 religious leaders in the fall to Congress, bringing up Israeli human rights abuses in the occupied Palestinian territories in Gaza, and asking Congress to open an inquiry with the idea that our aid would be made contingent on changing these human rights abuses. And the reason I bring it up to this assembly is it's a really good example of faith-based organizations doing grassroots advocacy that is very powerful, I think, on the human rights issue. The Carter Center endorsed that letter, I believe, and I want to thank you for that endorsement. And one thing that I did on a grassroots level then was to bring this letter to my congregation and ask each person in that congregation, A, to read the letter, B, to write a cover letter, take a copy of it, and put it again on their congressman's desk, saying, I am your constituent, and this matters to me. All of us, if we did that kind of advocacy regularly, could make a difference in educating the Congress. So thank you for your endorsement.
Just a quick comment. As you know, U.S. law and the Leahy Amendment specifically prohibits the allocation of military aid to military units that violate human rights systematically. And the Leahy Amendment itself has been explored as a potential tool to look at the occupation, both in the West Bank and Gaza. And this initiative by the churches, it's basically saying we should look at whether the Leahy Amendment, whether U.S. law in general is being violated. So that's quite appropriate for us to look at our military assistance and whether it's being used to systematically violate human rights. And that's all the letter was asking for, was that. I don't know if there were any other comments on that.
I want to make a brief general comment on the importance of grassroots support for human rights in the United States. Particularly now, and particularly in this climate that Karin and I have both been talking about in terms of the assault on human rights in the name of counterterrorism and the politics of fear that are still, in many ways, gripping our legislative activity in this whole field. I always felt, and I don't know whether you had the same feeling when you served as well, Bob, but when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, I felt quite vulnerable in an odd sort of way. I felt vulnerable because I had no constituency. Other parts of the government had constituencies, constituencies that could talk with a loud voice. Certainly constituencies on the economic side were very clearly there, and constituencies on the security side were very clearly there. The constituency for human rights is really all of you replicated across the country, but and people of goodwill engaging in lobbying is something that's extremely important. But frankly, I think, except for the Carter Center and a few other institutions, the Amnesty International to some extent, I would say, is in that category, most human rights organizations that are active in this field are effective as people who write very effectively or speak very effectively about the importance of human rights, but they don't have the kind of contact with at the local level with members of Congress and with their own local officials. I felt this very intensely at a time when I was actually under attack in the Congress for reporting on human rights to the U.S. Congress, reporting on the U.S. adherence to a very important treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which we have, I believe it was even signed, Mr. President, in your administration, certainly ratified subsequently, and requires the U.S. periodically to report to these UN bodies on its own record on human rights. And we made a report which was, I think, relatively candid, said that we are a work in progress. The U.S. has a continuing set of issues around civil rights and African Americans and minorities and women, and a variety of topics that I summarized in an introduction to that report. And I was immediately attacked by a number of senators in the U.S. Senate for actually using my office as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights to level an attack on the United States, which seemed quite inappropriate, they thought. Fortunately, there were many editorials and others came to my defense, and I certainly didn't feel personally in any way vilified. But it's just a good example, I think, that it's very important to have the kinds of grassroots support for human rights that can enter into the political bloodstream, if you will, in the way that Karin is so effectively doing in the Carter Center on issues like the one we just talked about now. So I just put that from the perspective of a government official serving in the field of human rights advocacy and grassroots support is all important.
Yes.
I was wondering if you've heard of United Religions Initiative, which is, it was started at the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, forming of the United Nations. And the idea was that religious wars are a good part of the reason that people go to war. And if we could sort of get the religions talking to each other, we could stop some of these wars. And I just wonder if you know about it and if you have worked with them at all.
Karin, hold on 1 second. Let's take one more question,
Okay.
and you might be up there.
Let me see if I can form this question. The protection of human rights is what you all have devoted your life to, and it seems to me an obvious thing to do, an obvious noble pursuit, but it also seems that there is a great opposition towards this obvious thing that we need to be doing. So I'm wondering what you have observed in your lives of your commitment to this that are some of the impediments to leaders and citizens seeing the importance of the protection of human rights, which seems that it would be at the forefront of all political endeavors.
Karin, why don't you start?
I'm not familiar with that particular initiative. There are many, I've heard of, and President Carter probably, and Mrs. Carter probably know more than I do, of all the various initiatives to get religious interfaith dialogue around peace. There are many of them. We've been engaging, in particular on this issue of women's rights. President Carter met the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Cairo last May, and then again in October in Cairo, to begin a dialogue among religious leaders on the issue of women's rights. But what I'll say is that sometimes the issue of women's rights becomes a sort of a Western agenda. They look at, when you come into a place like Egypt and you say, we want to talk about women's rights, they think, oh, you're coming to lecture us because we have issues on women's rights. But President Carter does not approach it in that way. He comes and he says, no, this is a universal problem. We have, domestic violence is a big issue in the United States, sex trafficking of girls and women. Atlanta, our own home city, is a major hub. This is a universal issue. So I think if we can create a mutuality, a sort of a reciprocity in this dialogue where it's not a lecturing, where one religion is more enlightened than the other, that's a key. And that has been difficult, particularly when the U.S. invasion of Iraq was looked by most of the Muslim world as a crusader war. It was seen that way. And we have a lot of healing to do around that. The question from the young lady, I'll let others if none of them answer it, I'll
Karin,
answer it, but I want to give them a chance.
Let me come in. First of all, I think you might get together with Camilla after this meeting and learn what more. Whenever we bring out this subject of human rights, there's always opposition in some ways. And when we started our human rights program that Bob mentioned in Latin America, you have to remember that the military dictators were in bed with the American commercial interests, because we would arrange with the dictators to have a monopoly on bananas or bauxite or iron or whatever that was very beneficial to them, and the dictators would agree with the American presidents that anybody that tried to rise up against them were communists. Now they're terrorists, but in those days it was communism. And we would actually send in our Marines, our Army, to defend the dictators who were protected by us against indigenous Indians and poor people that just wanted to have their own human rights protected. And so this has been a very serious problem for us. More recently, Karin and I and Rosalynn have been involved in trying to deal with the death penalty in America. We had an incident in Georgia this past week where a man was sentenced to be executed, and his death sentence was stayed just 30 minutes before he was supposed to be killed, and he's only given a 30-day cessation. So that's always sometimes maybe many of you in here agree that we ought to have the death penalty. We don't think we should. So another thing we've been dealing with is individual cases in countries where our government has a very friendly relationship, and even I have a friendly relationship with the president of that country, or the king, or whoever it is, that's perpetrating human rights violations, and we don't attack those leaders publicly. What I do is Karin drafts a letter, which I might change a little bit, and then I send the letter to that president and saying, we have received a report that such and such a person, who might be a human rights lawyer or a woman or something like that, is in prison, and that you are persecuting them, and we know that you really are not against human rights, and we urge you to release that person so we won't have to go public with it. And quite often, just in a very quiet way, all of a sudden we find out that that person has been released. So we try to do a lot of stuff privately just because you have to give people credit for correcting their own crimes or mistakes, and sometimes we have to realize that when we bring up an issue, it's going to be controversial. Recently, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed a resolution almost unanimously against genital cutting, the cutting of female genitals. And that's an issue in which we're involved. But when you bring that issue up in a society that's been cutting female genitals for centuries, they think it's a Western intrusion on their right to worship as they choose. We have the same thing with child marriage. A lot of girls 8, 9, 10 years old are forced into marriage. But that is a custom that they have honored in those societies, and when outsiders like us recommend change, they think it's a violation of their own independence or an arrogant Western style trying to get them to change their way of life. So whenever you bring up a human rights issue, almost invariably you can expect to be criticized or opposed in some ways.
And the young man whose execution was stayed is mentally retarded.
He's not young anymore because he's been in prison how long, 20 years?
He's 53 years old now.
He's 53 years old. He was young when he went in, but he's mentally retarded. So those are the kind of things with which we deal. I want to thank the panel. That's the last time I'm going to say anything. But it's been a superb presentation. Thank you all.
One last question.
Mike Nelson, thank you, Karin, John, and Bob. Your focus on human rights really struck a chord with me, and I think everybody here. To what extent do you find in your work out there, both nationally and internationally, that the opposition to human rights is really corporate self-interest, and today more and more anti-environmental interests, because I think there are huge concerns there? How much head bumping are you doing with corporations and what I call the anti-environmental movement in your work?
Okay. as President Carter just mentioned, this is at the root of many of the issues, because our government often, I'll just say just a word about the Congo as an example. The Congo has seen the largest loss of life since World War II. 5 to 6 million people have died in the conflict in the Congo since 1996. And it was a spillover from the Rwanda genocide, which resulted in destabilization in the region. And now 5 to 6 million. I mean, just wrap our heads around that. And part of the issue is that there has been this land grab for mineral wealth in the east and the southeast. And what we've been doing is trying to push the government into creating a regulatory framework and transparency in the mining industry. And one of our earliest obstacles was an American mining company that wouldn't cooperate with the publication of the mining deals that were struck with the government during the war years. So we had to really push them. This was an American mining company, which is a normally very honest country trying to do good business, et cetera. But the corporate interests are at the root of many of these issues, and so I think ultimately, one of the remedies the way we're approaching it is we're trying to work with Congolese civil society, human rights defenders, so that they can hold their own government accountable and bring forward the information about mining revenue, the environmental impact, et cetera. That's the solution. Is you've got to empower human rights activists and citizens in their own localities. The U.S. can't do it. The UN itself can't do it. President Carter mentioned these entrenched cultural practices. You have to figure out how to help those people within society who want the change. And we can do it. But every time we invade a country in the name of democracy, we set this back. This idea is set back because it looks like an imperialistic approach. We've got to approach it at a grassroots level, and that's what the Carter Center is trying to do. We're out of time. Would you like to?
Let me just say one word, if I could. I think it's not always easy to realize that you're in a moment of revolutionary change and exactly what the origins are. But I would say in this field of human rights and also in the broader field of democracy, it is a period of revolutionary change. And to a great extent, President and Mrs. Carter deserve absolutely huge credit for initiating a new approach to longstanding issues, not just through the work of the Carter Center and, as Karin has eloquently put, about helping to empower non-governmental organizations, helping to empower people to make their demands on governments to respect their human rights, but playing a critical role in election monitoring, in giving strength to groups that feel that elections can't be free, by just going out with a large and distinguished delegation, brings people out to demand their freedom and to give them a rise and to change the very norms of international organizations. All of the international organizations that came from World War II were built on a simple principle of state sovereignty. It was believed at that time that there is no better way to assure peace and human rights than respecting the self-determination of governments. But that left out people in governments that were abusing human rights, that were neglecting human rights, or that were repressing individuals. And what President Carter and the Carter Center have done is change that balance to introduce alongside the idea of state sovereignty, the idea of the right to protect in the United Nations, the idea of a collective defense of democracy which has been initiated in the inter-American system. The Carter Center hosts the Friends of the Inter-American Democratic Charter on Democracy. And that group itself raises these issues in a manner that states can no longer deny. So I think what you've heard this morning is a fundamental change that has occurred in international relations that allows the rights of people to be defended even if their governments won't defend them, even if their governments will abuse them. And I've learned from my own experience that things that we tried to do when President Carter was president, in some ways, they were easier to do by the Carter Center. We tried to negotiate a democratic transition in Nicaragua while he was president, and we failed. But the Carter Center succeeded as a non-governmental organization, gaining the respect in the way that President Carter does it so well, gaining the respect of all sides and showing respect to leaders who are hungry for it, perhaps don't deserve it, but in getting that respect, they are more inclined to be more positive and responsive. So I think the work of the Carter Center has continued that legacy and I think has advanced it and begun to change the world more broadly.